A quiet walk turned storm. The streets of West Hampton shimmered under the amber glow of aged streetlights. The night held a chill that whispered through the alleys, nudging shadows to stretch and merge into the uneven cobblestones. 16-year-old Jamal Carter moved slowly, his crutches rhythmically tapping against the pavement. Each step was a calculated motion, the faint echo of metal on stone blending with the rustling of leaves overhead. Jamal's leg, wrapped in a fresh cast, bore the evidence of a recent accident, his bicycle upended by a careless driver who hadn't even paused to check on him. Yet, as painful as the injury was, it wasn't what occupied his mind tonight. It was his father's words, spoken at dinner just hours ago. "The world won't give you fairness, Jamal, but it's your job to demand respect. Always stand tall, even if you're on crutches." His father, Richard Carter, was a local activist with a reputation that preceded him. Known for fiery speeches that called out systemic racism and injustice, Richard had earned respect and enemies. Tonight, as Jamal walked the 3 blocks home from his friend Malik's house, he carried not just his injury but the weight of his father's lessons. At his side, Daisy, a small mixed-breed dog with floppy ears and a loyal heart, trotted with nervous energy. Her sharp eyes scanned the shadows as her tail twitched like a radar. To Jamal, she was more than a companion. Daisy was his protector, his confidant. He reached down to scratch behind her ears, her warm fur grounding him against the unease that had been growing with each step. Ahead, the block was silent, save for the distant hum of a passing car. Jamal's home was only minutes away now, the warm light of the porch visible just around the bend. But as he turned the corner, the faint silhouette of a figure standing under a street lamp made his chest tighten. A police officer. The man stood tall, his posture rigid, his face obscured by the brim of his cap. The officer's badge caught the streetlight, gleaming like a cold, unblinking eye. Jamal's steps faltered as his stomach churned. He wasn't doing anything wrong, just walking home. Yet the weight of countless stories, of boys like him who had met unjust fates under similar circumstances, settled like a rock in his chest. Daisy growled low, her body pressing against Jamal's uninjured leg. The officer stepped forward, his boots crunching against the gravel. His hand rested on his belt, where a taser and handcuffs dangled ominously. "Hey, you," the officer barked. "Stop right there." Jamal froze, gripping his crutches tighter. His knuckles whitened as his heart hammered against his ribs. He willed himself to breathe, to remember his father's advice. Stay calm. Speak respectfully. Don't escalate. "Yes, sir," Jamal said, his voice steady despite the lump in his throat. The officer walked closer, his shadow swallowing Jamal's as he loomed over the teenager. His eyes narrowed as he scanned Jamal from head to toe, lingering on the cast and the dog. His lip curled in disdain. "What are you doing out here at this time of night?" the officer demanded. "Just heading home, sir," Jamal replied, nodding toward the direction of his house. The officer snorted, shaking his head. "Home, ha? On crutches? With that mutt? You expect me to believe that?" Jamal swallowed hard, his palms sweating against the rubber handles of his crutches. Daisy growled louder, her small frame vibrating with tension. Jamal tugged gently on her leash. "She's not a mutt," Jamal said quietly, his tone even. "She's my dog, Daisy. And yes, I'm going home. I live just a few blocks from here." The officer took another step forward, his boots inches from Daisy's trembling paws. He looked down at the dog, then back up at Jamal, a sneer twisting his face. "Dogs like that don't belong in neighborhoods like this. Neither do troublemakers." Jamal's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. He couldn't afford to. The officer's hand drifted toward his taser, his fingers flexing over the handle. Daisy's growling turned into sharp, defensive barks. "Quiet your dog before I do," the officer growled. "She's just scared," Jamal said, his voice breaking slightly despite his efforts to stay calm. "We'll be on our way." The officer's laugh was cold and hollow. You're not going anywhere until I'm done with you. Empty your pockets." Jamal hesitated. "I don't have anything, sir. Just my phone and some keys." "Do it now," the officer snapped, his tone brooking no argument. Jamal shifted unsteadily, balancing on one crutch as he fumbled with his pocket. His fingers brushed against the cool metal of his keys, but before he could pull them out, Daisy lunged forward, her bark sharp and fierce. She wasn't attacking, only trying to protect. The officer's reaction was immediate. He stepped back, drawing his taser in one swift motion. The sight of the weapon aimed at Daisy made Jamal's breath catch. "Call off your dog, or I'll put her down," the officer shouted. "Please," Jamal cried, dropping to his knee to grab Daisy's collar. "She's not dangerous. She's just scared." But the officer wasn't listening. His face was a mask of anger and authority, his eyes devoid of empathy. He stepped closer, the crackle of the taser audible as he prepared to fire. In that moment, Jamal knew. This wasn't about Daisy, or even about him walking home. This was about power, and the officer was determined to assert it. Shadows in the crowd. The air seemed to grow colder, heavier, as Jamal knelt on the cracked pavement, his heart pounding like a war drum. Daisy barked again, but this time it wasn't loud. It was sharp and deliberate, almost like a warning. Jamal gripped her collar tightly, whispering soft reassurances that he didn't entirely believe himself. "Please, sir," Jamal said, his voice cracking with a mix of desperation and restrained anger. "She's just scared. I'll keep her calm. We're not causing any trouble." The officer's eyes gleamed with something cruel, something too familiar to Jamal from the stories his father often shared, stories of unchecked authority masquerading as justice. The taser remained pointed, crackling faintly, its sparks lighting up the shadows between them. "You think you're in control here, kid," the officer said, taking a step closer, his shadow now looming over Jamal. "I don't take orders from you. I give them. You and that mutt of yours better figure that out before I make an example out of you." The word example hit Jamal like a blow. His father had explained this dynamic many times. Certain officers didn't just enforce the law. They used their badges to make statements, to remind people like Jamal that they were not truly free. Jamal's throat tightened. His grip on Daisy's leash trembled. The street was empty save for them, the quiet magnifying the tension. Jamal's home was just 2 blocks away, but it might as well have been miles. No one else was outside. Not yet. But then, faintly, there came the distant sound of footsteps. They were hesitant at first, cautious, but growing closer. A middle-aged woman emerged from the corner, holding a grocery bag in one hand and a phone in the other. Her face, illuminated by the streetlight, froze as she took in the scene. A young black teenager on crutches, a small dog snarling protectively, and a white police officer standing over them with a taser drawn. "What's going on here?" the woman called, her voice sharp but tinged with concern. The officer snapped his head toward her, his face twisting in irritation. "Ma'am, this is a police matter. Move along." The woman didn't budge. Instead, she raised her phone, angling it toward the officer. "A police matter? It looks more like you're threatening a kid and his dog. I'm recording this." Jamal felt a flicker of relief, but it was fleeting. He knew this could escalate further before it got better. Daisy barked again, louder this time, as if sensing the shift in power. The officer lowered his taser slightly, but didn't holster it. His jaw clenched, and his nostrils flared as he looked between Jamal and the woman. "I said move along, ma'am," he repeated, his tone harder now. "Interfering with police work is a crime." The woman didn't back down. "And so is abuse of power," she retorted. "I've got this all on video. If you have nothing to hide, then you shouldn't mind me staying." Jamal's heart raced as he watched the interaction. He wanted to thank her, to explain, but he knew better than to interrupt. He could see the storm brewing in the officer's face, the way his grip tightened on the taser. Another set of footsteps approached, this time quicker, more deliberate. A young man in his 20s jogged up, his hoodie pulled tight against the chill. He stopped short when he saw the scene, his eyes narrowing. "Yo, what's going on here?" he asked, pulling out his phone. The officer's face hardened further, his hand twitching near his taser. "This is a police matter. Step back. Looks like harassment to me," the man said, holding up his phone. "You're threatening a kid on crutches. Man, what's wrong with you?" By now, a small crowd was beginning to gather, drawn by the commotion. An older man in a flat cap and a young mother pushing a stroller stopped nearby, their expressions ranging from concern to outrage. Someone whispered, "Isn't that Jamal Carter? His dad's the activist, right?" The officer's composure started to crack. He stepped back slightly, scanning the growing crowd. "You're all obstructing justice," he barked. "Disperse now, or I'll start making arrests." The woman with the groceries stepped forward, her voice louder now. "Obstructing justice. Is that what you call pointing a weapon at a teenager and his dog? Shame on you." The murmurs in the crowd grew louder, angrier. Phones were raised, their cameras capturing every moment. Jamal's heart swelled with a mix of fear and hope. This wasn't the kind of protection he had imagined when he left Malik's house, but it was something. The officer's face flushed red, his anger barely contained. He jabbed a finger toward Jamal. "This punk was acting suspicious. I was investigating. You all need to mind your business." The young man in the hoodie laughed bitterly. "Suspicious? He's walking home on crutches with a dog. What's suspicious about that?" Jamal finally found his voice. "I just want to go home," he said, his words quiet but steady. He looked directly at the officer, his brown eyes meeting the man's icy glare. "I'm not a threat. I've done nothing wrong." The officer's lip curled. For a moment, Jamal thought he might lunge forward, might try to grab him or Daisy. But then the officer noticed the phones, the crowd, the undeniable evidence. "This isn't over," the officer hissed, his voice low enough that only Jamal could hear. Then, louder, he addressed the crowd. "Fine. Have it your way. But don't think this changes anything." He holstered his taser and stepped back, his movements stiff and reluctant. The crowd erupted into murmurs of relief and outrage, their voices blending into a chaotic symphony. Jamal exhaled shakily, his grip on Daisy loosening slightly. The woman with the groceries knelt beside him. "Are you okay, honey?" she asked gently, her eyes scanning his face. Jamal nodded, though his legs trembled. "I'm okay. Thank you." The young man in the hoodie clapped him on the shoulder. "We've got your back. Bro, don't let this shake you." The officer disappeared into the shadows, but his presence lingered like a stain. Jamal looked around at the crowd, at the faces filled with concern and solidarity. For the first time that night, he didn't feel completely alone. But as he slowly stood, his crutches unsteady beneath him, he knew this wasn't the end. His father had always said that injustice didn't fade quietly. It had to be fought, tooth and nail. And now, Jamal realized he was part of that fight. The ripples begin. The quiet of the night was gone, replaced by the murmurs and shouts of the gathering crowd. Though the officer had retreated, his shadow still loomed over Jamal. The humiliation, the anger, and the fear churned inside him like a storm. He clutched his crutches tightly as the woman who had recorded the incident helped steady him. Daisy stood by his side, her tail twitching nervously, but her growls subsiding. "Come on, let's get you home," the woman said, her voice softening. She gestured to the young man in the hoodie, who nodded in agreement. Jamal hesitated. The street that had once felt so familiar now seemed alien, every shadow a threat. But he didn't want to seem weak, not in front of these people, not after everything they had witnessed. "I'm okay," he said, forcing strength into his voice. "I can make it." "You shouldn't have to walk alone," the woman insisted. "Not after what just happened." The crowd murmured in agreement. Someone offered to carry his bag. Another offered to walk ahead to ensure the officer didn't return. Jamal was overwhelmed by the sudden outpouring of support. It felt foreign but welcome, a shield against the fear still clinging to him. With Daisy's leash in one hand and a crutch under the other, Jamal began to move. The woman walked beside him, and the young man stayed a few steps behind, his phone still out, capturing the aftermath. The crowd dispersed gradually, their whispers echoing in the cool night air. A father's fury. When they reached his house, the porch light illuminated a familiar figure. Richard Carter stood tall and imposing, his arms crossed, his eyes burning with a mix of relief and fury. He had just gotten off the phone with one of the neighbors who had seen the incident unfold. The news had sent him into a panic, and he had barely stopped himself from storming out into the streets. Jamal. His voice boomed as he hurried down the porch steps. His gaze softened slightly as he saw his son, but his anger remained palpable. "Are you hurt? What happened?" Jamal shook his head, though his voice wavered when he replied, "I'm fine, Dad. He's not fine," the woman interjected, placing a protective hand on Jamal's shoulder. "Your son was harassed by a cop just a block away. If we hadn't been there." Her words trailed off, but the implication hung in the air. Richard's fists clenched, and he took a deep breath, steadying himself. "Thank you," he said to the woman and the young man. "Thank you for being there." The young man nodded. "We've got video. A lot of it." The cop pointed a taser at the kid and his dog. "It's all over the place now." Richard's brow furrowed. "All over the place. It's gone viral," the woman explained. "I posted it online as soon as I got home. People are sharing it everywhere." Richard's heart sank and soared simultaneously. His son was safe, but this was far from over. The footage would bring attention, yes, but it would also bring backlash. He had seen it too many times before. "Come inside," Richard said, his voice firm. "We'll talk about this, but first, you need to rest." The video spreads. Inside the modest living room, the air buzzed with tension. The glow of Richard's laptop cast sharp shadows as he played the video that was now making its rounds on social media. The scene was raw, the officer's aggression unmistakable. Comments flooded the post, some offering support, others spewing the same tired justifications Richard had been fighting against for years. Another thug caught in the act probably deserved it. This is what happens when you don't obey authority. But then there were voices of solidarity, louder and more numerous than Richard had dared hope. "This is disgusting. When will this stop? Protect our kids. Jamal deserves justice." Richard rubbed his temples as he scrolled through the comments. He knew what came next. Reporters would call, activists would rally, and the police department would scramble to control the narrative. His son, his sweet, thoughtful boy, was about to become the face of a movement he hadn't asked to join. "I didn't mean for this to happen," Jamal said, breaking the silence. He sat on the couch, Daisy curled up beside him. "I just wanted to get home." Richard knelt in front of his son, placing a hand on his knee. "This isn't your fault, Jamal. None of it. That officer didn't see a kid on crutches. He saw a threat because of your skin color. That's the truth we've been fighting against for years." Jamal's eyes filled with tears, but he blinked them away. "I don't want to be a symbol, Dad. I don't want people looking at me like I'm some victim." "You're not a victim," Richard said firmly. "You're a survivor. And whether we like it or not, this moment is bigger than us. What happened to you will help others see the truth. We just have to make sure that truth gets heard." The fallout begins. By morning, the world had changed. The video was featured on national news networks. Anchors debated the footage, dissecting every word and action. Activist groups called for justice, demanding the officer's suspension and an investigation into the department. Social media was ablaze with hashtags like #JusticeForJamal and #EndPoliceBrutality. But the backlash wasn't far behind. The local police department released a statement claiming that the officer had acted within protocol, citing Jamal's suspicious behavior as justification for the stop. They made no mention of the taser, the aggression, or the officer's insults. Richard wasn't surprised. He had been bracing for this, but what he didn't expect was the coordinated attack on his family's character. Old photos of Richard at protests, taken out of context, circulated online. Anonymous accounts accused him of being anti-police and a troublemaker. "They're coming for us," Richard said grimly as he sat with Jamal at the kitchen table. "They'll try to discredit us, to make it seem like you deserved what happened." Jamal frowned. "But that's not true." "It doesn't have to be true," Richard replied. "It just has to be loud enough for people to believe it." The phone rang, cutting through the heavy silence. Richard answered, his expression darkening as he listened. When he hung up, he looked at Jamal with steely resolve. "That was a reporter," he said. "They want an interview. Not just about the video, but about you, our family, everything. If we do this, it'll bring more attention, but it'll also bring more heat. Are you ready for that?" Jamal hesitated. The idea of cameras, questions, and judgment made his stomach churn. But then he thought about the crowd that had gathered, about the people who had stood up for him when he couldn't stand for himself. "I don't know if I'm ready," he admitted, his voice quiet. "But I think we have to do it." Richard nodded, pride glinting in his eyes. "Then we'll do it together." The fight ahead. The decision to speak out was just the beginning. As the day unfolded, the Carter household became a hub of activity. Activists and lawyers reached out, offering support. Neighbors dropped by with food and words of encouragement. The local community rallied behind them, determined to turn Jamal's ordeal into a catalyst for change. But for every act of kindness, there was a new challenge. A hateful comment, a threatening message, a reminder that the fight for justice was never easy. Jamal sat by the window that evening, watching as the sun dipped below the horizon. Daisy rested her head on his lap, her eyes half closed. He stroked her fur absent-mindedly, his thoughts racing. He didn't ask for this. He didn't want this. But as his father had said, some truths couldn't be ignored. And now, like it or not, he was part of something bigger. The echo of justice. The sun had barely risen over West Hampton when the phone rang again, pulling Richard from his restless sleep. He had spent the night pacing the house, his mind consumed by the storm of attention surrounding Jamal. The weight of his own experiences as an activist had never felt heavier. Now the battle wasn't just against an unjust system. It was a fight to protect his family from becoming its next casualty. He rubbed his eyes, groggy from the sleepless night, and glanced at the clock. It was barely 6 a.m., too early for the media frenzy that had already begun. His heart sank as he recognized the number. "Hello, Mr. Carter, this is Delilah Hart from Channel 7 News." The voice on the other end spoke quickly, almost too fast for him to fully grasp. "We'd like to set up an interview with you and your son for the evening broadcast. It's a chance to speak out, to share your side of the story, and to help show the truth of what happened last night. There's already a lot of support building behind your family. This could really help move the conversation forward." Richard paused, his mind running in 1,000 directions. He had expected this. The media would circle, eager for a piece of the narrative. But this wasn't just about them. This was about Jamal. And it was about time that his son's story was told by someone who knew the truth. "I'll need to speak with Jamal first," Richard replied, the weight of his words lingering in the quiet house. "We'll be there." The call to action. By the time the camera crew arrived, Jamal had already showered, but the weight of the situation was evident in the tightness of his shoulders. He sat at the kitchen table, his crutches beside him, his expression a mixture of uncertainty and resolve. Daisy lay by his feet, her presence providing him with the comfort he had so desperately needed after the tense encounter with the officer. "Dad," Jamal said quietly, breaking the silence. "I'm not sure about this. It's too much, too soon." Richard sat beside him, placing a reassuring hand on his son's shoulder. I know, son. I know it's scary. But sometimes we don't get to choose the moment. It chooses us. And you're not alone in this. We're doing this together. The camera crew, a mix of 2 cameramen and a sound technician, set up in the living room. The lights flickered on, harsh and uninviting, but Richard didn't care. The spotlight wasn't for him. It was for Jamal, for the boy who had been reduced to a statistic far too many times before. His voice had to be heard. As the crew positioned themselves, Jamal shifted uneasily in his seat, adjusting his crutches and glancing nervously at the lens. Richard squeezed his son's hand. "You don't have to be perfect," Richard whispered. "Just be yourself. Tell them what happened. Tell them your truth." Jamal nodded, trying to calm the storm inside him. "Okay, Dad. I'll try." The interview. Delilah Hart, the reporter, sat across from them, her notepad in hand, her expression professional but warm. She knew the weight of what she was about to ask. The gravity of the situation was palpable in the room. As the camera began to roll, Delilah offered a small smile, one meant to ease the tension. "Thank you for agreeing to this interview, Mr. and Mrs. Carter," Delilah began. "Jamal, I know this isn't easy, but people are watching. They want to understand what happened last night. Can you start by telling us what went through your mind when the officer first stopped you?" Jamal took a deep breath, his fingers lightly brushing Daisy's fur for comfort. He looked at his father, who nodded in encouragement. "I knew I hadn't done anything wrong," Jamal began, his voice steady despite the emotions swirling inside him. "I was just walking home. I didn't even get to make it home before he stopped me. He didn't ask if I was okay. He didn't ask if I needed help. He just saw a black kid on crutches, and I guess that was enough for him. He started demanding I stop. And I don't know. Something just felt off. Like he was already angry at me before he even knew who I was." Richard watched his son, his heart swelling with pride. Jamal had always been a quiet, introspective boy, never one for confrontation. But here he was, speaking his truth into a world that desperately needed to hear it. "And when the officer pointed the taser at your dog, Daisy," Delilah continued, "how did that make you feel?" Jamal's gaze softened as he glanced at Daisy, who had been quietly sitting at his feet throughout the interview. "She's not just a dog," he said, his voice firm. "She's my best friend. She's been there for me when no one else was." I just couldn't believe it. He wasn't threatening me anymore. He was threatening her. And all I could think was, if he did anything to her, I wouldn't have been able to stop him. Richard's hand tightened around his son's. He had known how hard this was for Jamal, how much it cost him to open up, to lay himself bare for the world to see. But he also knew that this moment, this interview, was more than just their family's pain. It was a wake-up call to everyone who was watching. "And what about the officer's comments?" Delilah asked, her voice softening slightly. His words seemed personal. "How did that affect you?" Jamal paused, his brow furrowing. "I don't know. I guess it felt like he had already decided who I was before we even spoke. He didn't care about who I really was, just what he thought I was. I was just another kid he had to put in his place, and that hurt. That hurt more than anything." Richard's eyes burned with anger at the thought, but he forced himself to focus on Jamal. His son's courage gave him the strength to push forward. "Jamal," Delilah said, "this is a question I know many people are asking. What do you want to see happen now?" Jamal met her gaze, his expression resolute. "I want accountability. I want the officer who did this to understand that he can't treat people like that and just walk away. But more than that, I want people to understand that this isn't about me. This isn't just my story. This is about everyone who's been unfairly treated, everyone who's been stopped or hurt for just being who they are. This is about everyone who's afraid to speak out." The weight of Jamal's words settled heavily in the room. Richard's heart swelled with a mixture of pride and sorrow. His son, the same boy who had once been afraid to stand up for himself, was now speaking not just for himself, but for an entire generation of young people who had been silenced by a broken system. The ripple effect. As the camera crew packed up and left, Jamal sat quietly on the couch, the energy of the interview still buzzing in his veins. Richard remained beside him, offering no words at first, just a steady presence. "You did good, son," Richard said finally, his voice soft but filled with pride. Jamal shrugged, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "It's not about me, though, is it?" "No," Richard said, shaking his head. "It's about us. All of us. And it's about time we made sure they know we're not going anywhere." The next few days were a whirlwind. News outlets from across the country reached out for interviews. The video of the incident, now viewed by millions, became a focal point for nationwide protests against police brutality. People of all ages, races, and backgrounds gathered in cities across the country, holding signs that read #Justice for Jamal and #No More Violence. But even with the surge of support, there were those who tried to tear the movement down. The police department issued a statement, doubling down on their initial claim that the officer had acted within the law. They hinted that Jamal's behavior, coupled with Daisy's aggressive response, had left the officer no choice but to react the way he did. Richard saw the lies for what they were. The officer had made his decision before he even knew Jamal's name. The system had already judged them both. But the more they fought, the more they spoke, the more the truth spread. The support continued to grow, and the pressure mounted on the police department. People began questioning why this happened, why it happened to Jamal, and why it kept happening to so many others. The turning point. One night, as the protests escalated, Richard received an unexpected call. It was from a reporter at a major news network. "Mr. Carter," the voice said, "we've just received an anonymous tip. There's documentation showing that Officer Matthews, the one involved in the incident with your son, has been the subject of multiple complaints over the years. Complaints about excessive force, racial profiling, even verbal abuse. We've got the proof, and we're ready to expose it." Richard felt a cold rush of disbelief flood through him. This was it. This was the moment they had been waiting for. "This isn't just about your son anymore," the reporter continued. "It's about the system, and it's all going to come out." A crack in the system. The next morning, the world felt like it had shifted on its axis. The story that had begun as a viral video of a teenager on crutches being harassed by a police officer had now taken on a life of its own. News outlets across the country were abuzz with breaking updates. Officer Matthews, the man who had threatened Jamal and Daisy, had a history of misconduct spanning over a decade. Anonymous whistleblowers had leaked internal documents to investigative journalists, revealing complaints of excessive force, racial profiling, and abuse of authority. The reports were damning. In one instance, Matthews had handcuffed a 12-year-old boy for looking suspicious while playing basketball in his own driveway. In another, he had used a taser on an unarmed man during a routine traffic stop, later claiming the man posed a threat. Each revelation was worse than the last. The public outcry intensified, with hashtags like #Hold Matthews Accountable and #EndPoliceImpunity trending worldwide. Protests swelled in size, no longer confined to West Hampton. In New York, Los Angeles, Atlanta, and Chicago, streets filled with demonstrators carrying signs that bore Jamal's face alongside messages of solidarity. A meeting of minds. At the Carter household, the living room had become a makeshift command center. Richard sat at the head of the dining table, surrounded by community leaders, activists, and lawyers. Jamal, though still tired and overwhelmed, sat nearby with Daisy at his feet. He listened intently as voices rose and fell around him. "We need to strike while the iron is hot," said Tanya Reid, a civil rights attorney with a reputation for taking on impossible cases. The documents expose Matthews, but they also point to a systemic problem. This isn't just about one bad cop. It's about a department that protects and enables officers like him. Another activist, a younger man named Malik Robinson, nodded. "Tanya's right. We've got the attention now." But attention fades fast if we don't act. We need a clear plan. What about a class action lawsuit? Suggested one of the community leaders. There are enough victims here to make a strong case. Richard raised a hand, his expression thoughtful. Before we talk about lawsuits, we need to focus on accountability. The public's trust in the system is already shattered. If Matthews walks away with a slap on the wrist, it'll only deepen the divide. Jamal, who had been quiet until now, spoke up. His voice was steady but tinged with uncertainty. What about the people who don't have videos? The ones who went through this and had no one to back them up. How do we help them? The room fell silent. Richard looked at his son, pride evident in his eyes. That's the question we need to answer, he said. And it starts with making sure Matthews doesn't get away with this. The department's defense. The West Hampton Police Department held a press conference later that day. Their chief of police, Gregory Shaw, standing at the podium. The room was packed with reporters, their cameras and microphones trained on him like spotlights. We take these allegations seriously, Chief Shaw began, his tone measured. Officer Matthews has been placed on administrative leave pending an internal investigation. However, I want to remind everyone that due process must be respected. The actions of one officer do not reflect the values of this department. Richard watched the press conference from home, his jaw tightening with every word. It was the same tired script he had heard countless times before. Administrative leave was nothing more than a paid vacation, a delay tactic meant to quell public outrage without enacting real change. Due process, Richard muttered under his breath, shaking his head. What about all the people Matthews didn't give due process to? The press conference continued, but it was clear the reporters weren't buying it. One journalist raised her hand, her voice cutting through the room like a knife. Chief Shaw, do you deny that Officer Matthews has faced numerous complaints over the years, including allegations of racial profiling and excessive force? Shaw hesitated, the brief pause betraying his discomfort. As I said, we are conducting a thorough investigation. Until that process is complete, I cannot comment on the specifics of Officer Matthews' record. Another journalist pressed him further. How do you explain the fact that none of these complaints resulted in disciplinary action? Is this not evidence of a systemic issue within your department? The chief's face hardened. We follow strict protocols for handling complaints. Any suggestion that we tolerate misconduct is simply false. The tension in the room was palpable. Richard turned off the television, unable to stomach anymore. He looked at Jamal, who sat quietly on the couch, scrolling through his phone. They're lying, Jamal said softly, his eyes fixed on the screen. Everyone knows it, but they're still lying. A new ally. Later that evening, Richard received a call from an unexpected source. It was from Detective Maria Hernandez, a veteran officer in the West Hampton Police Department who had quietly supported Richard's activism for years. Richard, it's Maria, she said, her voice low and cautious. I'm calling off the record. Richard sat up straighter, his curiosity piqued. Maria, what's going on? I'm risking a lot by telling you this, but you need to know, she began. Matthews has more dirt on him than what's already come out. The department's scrambling to cover it up, but some of us are fed up. If you push hard enough, you can force their hand. Richard's grip on the phone tightened. Why are you telling me this? Because I'm tired, Richard, Maria admitted. Tired of watching people like Matthews tarnish the badge, while the rest of us are left to clean up the mess. This system won't change unless someone forces it to. Do you have proof? Richard asked. I can get it, Maria replied. But I need to be careful. If they find out I'm helping you. They won't, Richard assured her. You've done enough by reaching out. I'll handle the rest. As he hung up, Richard felt a renewed sense of purpose. The cracks in the system were widening, and now was the time to strike. The community speaks. The following day, Richard organized a press conference of his own. Held at the local community center, it was packed with reporters, activists, and members of the community. Jamal sat in the front row, flanked by his mother and Daisy, while Richard took the stage. "Last week, my son was harassed and humiliated by someone who swore an oath to protect and serve," Richard began, his voice steady but impassioned. "But this isn't just about Jamal. This is about a system that allows officers like Matthews to operate with impunity." He gestured to the crowd behind him. "This community has suffered for too long. We've been ignored, silenced, and dismissed, but not anymore. We demand accountability, not just for Matthews, but for every officer who thinks they're above the law." The room erupted in applause, the energy palpable. Jamal felt a surge of pride as he watched his father speak, his words cutting through the noise like a blade. "This is just the beginning," Richard continued. "We will not stop until justice is served, not just for my son, but for every person who has been victimized by this broken system. Together, we will make them listen." A growing movement. As the days passed, the movement continued to grow. Protesters marched in cities across the country, their chants echoing through the streets. Donations poured in to support the legal battle against Matthews and the department. Activists organized town halls, rallies, and social media campaigns, ensuring the momentum didn't wane. But the fight was far from over. The department doubled down on their defense of Matthews, while anonymous threats began targeting the Carters. Jamal received hateful messages on social media, and a brick was thrown through their living room window one night, shattering the glass and rattling the family. Still, they refused to back down. A glimmer of hope. One evening, as the family gathered in the kitchen for dinner, Richard's phone buzzed with a notification. He opened the message and froze, his eyes widening. "What is it?" Jamal asked, concern etched on his face. Richard turned the phone toward him, a rare smile breaking through his usual stoic expression. It was a headline from a major news outlet. "Internal investigation launched into West Hampton Police Department amid mounting pressure." "They're starting to crack," Richard said, his voice filled with quiet triumph. "This is just the beginning." Jamal looked at his father, a spark of hope igniting in his chest. For the first time since that fateful night, he allowed himself to believe that change was possible. Justice in the balance. The Carter family's home buzzed with activity. What had once been a quiet space was now a hub of planning and resistance. Community leaders came and went, lawyers pored over documents, and activists prepared for rallies. The air was thick with urgency, but it was also charged with hope. This was more than a fight for justice. It was a battle for systemic change. Jamal, still recovering from the emotional and physical toll of the encounter, watched the flurry of activity with mixed emotions. On one hand, he was proud that his story had ignited something so powerful. On the other, he felt the heavy burden of being at the center of it all. Every step he took, every word he said, seemed to carry the weight of an entire movement. The investigation unfolds. The leaked documents had done more damage to the West Hampton Police Department than anyone had anticipated. The public outcry had forced an internal investigation, but the department's credibility was already in tatters. Activists like Richard, with the support of whistleblowers like Detective Maria Hernandez, were relentless in their pursuit of the truth. Maria had come through with more damning evidence, emails and internal memos showing that complaints against Officer Matthews had been intentionally buried. Supervisors had dismissed allegations of excessive force as misunderstandings and praised Matthews for his strong presence in difficult neighborhoods. It was clear that Matthews wasn't just a rogue officer. He was a symptom of a deeply flawed system. When the evidence was leaked to the press, it created a firestorm. National news outlets dissected every detail, from the culture of cover-ups within the department to the systemic bias that allowed officers like Matthews to operate unchecked. The story wasn't just about Jamal anymore. It was about a system on trial. The public response. Across the country, protests grew larger and more coordinated. In West Hampton, a massive rally took place outside City Hall. Thousands of people filled the streets, holding signs that read "Justice for Jamal," "Stop police violence," and "Reform the system." The crowd chanted in unison, their voices echoing off the tall buildings that surrounded them. Jamal and Richard stood on the steps of City Hall, looking out over the sea of supporters. Jamal felt his heart swell with a mix of pride and anxiety. He had never spoken in front of so many people before. His father placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "Just speak from the heart," Richard said. "They're here because of you. They believe in you." When it was his turn to speak, Jamal stepped forward, gripping the microphone tightly. He took a deep breath, his eyes scanning the crowd. Daisy sat at his feet, her presence steadying him. "I didn't ask to be here," Jamal began, his voice trembling slightly. "I didn't ask to be stopped that night, to be treated like I didn't matter. But here I am, and I'm not going to stay silent." The crowd erupted in applause, but Jamal pressed on. "What happened to me isn't just about me," he continued. "It's about everyone who's been judged, mistreated, or hurt because of how they look or where they come from. It's about a system that sees us as problems instead of people." He paused, his voice growing stronger. "But we're not problems. We're fighters. We're survivors. And together, we're going to make them see us for who we really are." The crowd roared, the sound reverberating through the city. Jamal stepped back, his chest heaving with emotion. Richard hugged him tightly, whispering, "You did good, son. You did real good." The trial of Officer Matthews. The pressure on the West Hampton Police Department was immense. Matthews was suspended without pay, and after weeks of public outcry, he was officially charged with misconduct and excessive use of force. It was a historic moment, one that would have been unthinkable without the video evidence and the collective voice of the community. The courtroom was packed on the first day of the trial. Jamal and his family sat in the front row, their presence a stark reminder of what was at stake. Matthews sat at the defendant's table, his face a mask of defiance. His lawyer argued that Matthews had followed protocol, claiming that Jamal's behavior had been uncooperative and that Daisy had been aggressive. The prosecution, armed with video evidence and testimony from witnesses, including Maria Hernandez, painted a very different picture. They highlighted Matthews' history of complaints and the department's repeated failure to hold him accountable. They played the video of the incident for the jury, the crackle of the taser and the officer's harsh words echoing in the silent courtroom. Jamal was called to the stand. As he recounted the events of that night, his voice steady despite the weight of the moment, he felt the eyes of the jury on him. He spoke not just of his fear and humiliation, but of his determination to stand up for what was right. "I didn't deserve what happened to me," Jamal said, his voice firm. "No one does. This isn't just about one night or one officer. It's about a system that needs to change." The verdict. After weeks of testimony, the jury deliberated for 2 tense days. The nation held its breath as the verdict was read. Guilty on multiple counts, including misconduct and excessive use of force. The courtroom erupted in emotion. Jamal felt tears streaming down his face as his family embraced him. Outside, the streets of West Hampton were filled with cheers and chants of victory. It was a moment of triumph, but Richard knew the fight wasn't over. "This is just one step," Richard said to the reporters gathered outside the courthouse. "We've won this battle, but the war for justice is far from over. This verdict proves that accountability is possible, but it's up to us to make sure it doesn't end here." A new chapter. In the weeks that followed, Jamal's story became a rallying cry for reform. Police departments across the country faced renewed scrutiny, and communities pushed for policies to increase transparency and accountability. Jamal returned to school, where he was met with support from classmates and teachers who admired his courage. Richard continued his activism with a renewed sense of purpose. He worked tirelessly to advocate for systemic change, ensuring that the momentum sparked by Jamal's story didn't fade. He and Jamal often spoke at events together, their bond stronger than ever. As the months turned into years, Jamal's encounter with Officer Matthews became a turning point in the fight for justice. It was a reminder that change was possible when people stood together, when they refused to be silenced. And though the road ahead was long and uncertain, Jamal walked it with his head held high, his father by his side, and Daisy trotting faithfully at his feet.